There is a kind of silence that only happens in a very old city, in a very small room, in the hours when no one else is awake. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a man sitting alone with thoughts he cannot stop. In a darkness he has come to know better than daylight. And in Paris, in a sixth-floor garret on the Rue de l'Odéon, there was a man who lived inside that silence for more than 50 years. His name was Emil Cioran, and if you have never heard of him, that is partly by design. He wrote books that people still read today, in dozens of languages, books with titles that tell you almost everything you need to know. The Trouble with Being Born, A Short History of Decay, The Temptation to Exist. He wrote about despair the way other people write about love, with precision, with tenderness, with the intimacy of someone who has lived inside it so long that he has memorized every corner of the room. He wrote about the inconvenience of existing at all, about the strange burden of waking up each morning into a life you did not ask for, about the seduction of simply not being here anymore. And he wrote, always, in the small, bitter hours when other people were asleep, because Emil Cioran could not sleep. Had not slept properly, he said, since he was a boy of 17. The insomnia was the great catastrophe of his life. It was also, he admitted, the source of everything he ever wrote. But here is what is less often said. Here is the part that gets left out of the introductions, the biographical notes, the dust jackets of his books, before Paris, before the garret, before the silence and the aphorisms and the careful French prose. There was a young man in a country that no longer exists, writing things that would haunt him for the rest of his life, things he spent decades trying to bury, things that, even now, scholars are still finding in the archives in the original Romanian, in passages that never made it into the translations. Emil Cioran praised Adolf Hitler. He celebrated fascism with a fervour that would later seem impossible, coming from the same pen that wrote so quietly about the futility of all human action. He threw himself behind a movement that murdered thousands of his own countrymen, and he did it in print, with his name attached in language that was not cautious, was not hedged, was not the youthful indiscretion his later defenders would try to make it seem. He believed, or at least he wrote as though he believed. And then the war ended, and he simply stopped. Moved to Paris, adopted French, became someone else entirely. The question his readers are still asking, the question that has no clean answer, is whether the quiet of his later writing was wisdom, whether the resignation, the refusal of hope, the long, slow surrender to meaninglessness was the hard-won peace of a man who had seen what belief could do and wanted no part of it ever again, or whether it was something else, whether it was a very long act of looking away. To understand any of it, we have to go back. Back to a village in the Carpathian Mountains, to a country that would be carved up and remade so many times in the 20th century that its borders seem almost like suggestions. Back to a boy who could not sleep, and who walked the streets at night, and who found in that walking a kind of terrible freedom. So settle in. This is a long story, and a complicated one, and we have all the time in the world to tell it. The village was called Resigned. It sits in the Transylvanian region of what is now Romania, in the foothills of the southern Carpathians, in a landscape of steep meadows and dark forests and small white churches with wooden steeples. In 1911, when Emil Cioran was born there, Romania was a young kingdom, barely 40 years old, still finding its shape in the uncertain aftermath of Ottoman decline and Habsburg influence. The village was Romanian-speaking, Orthodox, connected to the larger world by rough roads and by the nearness of the town of Sibiu, a place of Saxon traders and medieval walls, where German was spoken in the market squares and the architecture looked more like Austria than Bucharest. Cioran's father was an Orthodox priest. This mattered. In villages like Resigned, the priest was not merely a spiritual figure but a community leader, an educated man in a place where education was rare, a link to the traditions and the language and the sense of identity that held a people together. The house where Emil grew up was a house full of books, full of ritual, full of a particular kind of seriousness about the world. His mother was devout, practical, the anchor of a household that included several children. By all accounts, it was a happy childhood, at least at first. The mountains were beautiful. The seasons turned in their ancient rhythm. The boy went to the local school and then, because he was clever, was sent to the Romanian lycée in Sibiu, 7 kilometres away, where he would receive the classical education that was supposed to lead to university, to a profession, to a respectable life. But something happened to him in those years. Something broke, or opened, or twisted into a shape that would never quite straighten again. He began, around the age of 17, to lose the ability to sleep. We do not know exactly why. The later Cioran would offer explanations, partial and contradictory, in essays and interviews scattered across decades. He would say it began with anxiety, with a kind of dread that would descend on him in the evenings and refuse to lift. He would say it was physical, a disorder of the nervous system, a body that simply would not surrender to rest. He would say it was philosophical, that once you began to think certain thoughts, to see the world in a certain way, sleep became a kind of betrayal, a forgetting that the insomniac could not afford. What is clear is that by the time he was a young man, Emil Cioran was spending his nights awake, walking, thinking, filling notebooks with thoughts that had nowhere else to go. Imagine what that does to a person. Imagine being 18, 19, 20 years old, in a small provincial town in the Carpathian foothills, and knowing that when the sun goes down you will not rest, that you will lie in your bed and feel the hours pass, and that at some point you will give up and get dressed and go out into the streets, and that the streets will be empty, and the only sounds will be your own footsteps and the occasional barking of a dog, and that you will walk and walk until the sky begins to lighten, and the first carts appear on the road, and the world pretends to begin again, having never stopped for you. Cioran would later describe these nights in Sibiu as the crucible of his entire philosophy. The insomnia, he said, taught him what he would spend the rest of his life writing about. That existence is an affliction, that consciousness is a wound, that to be awake when everyone else is asleep is to glimpse a truth about the human condition that the well-rested will never understand. The happy, the hopeful, the people who sleep through the night and wake refreshed. They are living in a kind of dream, he thought, a comfortable fiction. The insomniac sees through it, and what he sees is not pretty. But there is something else the insomnia did to him, something he spoke of less often, and perhaps understood less clearly. It made him hungry for intensity, for meaning, for something large enough to fill all those empty hours, all that restless energy, all that accumulated despair. A man who cannot sleep is a man who cannot rest, and a man who cannot rest is a man who is always looking for something. Something to do, something to believe, something to throw himself into with the full force of a nervous system that has been running on empty for years. He went to university in Bucharest. This was in the late 1920s, and Bucharest in those years was a strange and volatile place. A city trying to be Paris, trying to be Vienna, while underneath it the old peasant Romania churned with grievances and ambitions that the elegant boulevards could not quite contain. The university was a hotbed of ideas, of arguments, of young men who felt that the world was on the edge of something momentous, and who disagreed violently about what that something should be. Communism was in the air, nationalism was in the air. The old liberal order that had governed Romania since its independence was beginning to seem tired, corrupt, inadequate to the crises of the age. And everywhere there was the sense that history was accelerating, that the choices made now would determine everything, that there was no time for caution or half measures. Cioran fit right in. He was brilliant, everyone agreed. His mind moved fast, too fast for most conversations, and he could talk and write and argue with a ferocity that made older professors nervous. He read voraciously, the German philosophers, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche especially, but also the mystics, the theologians, the poets of despair and ecstasy. He was drawn to extremes. The middle path, the sensible compromise, the balanced view, these held no interest for him. What interested him was the edge, the precipice, the place where thought goes when it has exhausted all the comfortable answers. And he was still not sleeping. If anything, the insomnia was worse in Bucharest, where the city never quite quieted down, where there were cafes open late and arguments to be had and streets to walk and no mountains to remind him of the permanence of things. He was falling apart and burning bright at the same time, producing work at a rate that astonished his teachers, making friends who would remain important to him for the rest of his life, men like Mircea Eliade, who would become one of the great scholars of comparative religion, and Constantin Neucker, who would become a philosopher of note, and Eugene Ionesco, who would later write plays about the absurdity of language and existence, and would remember Cioran from those years as someone who already seemed to be living on a different frequency than everyone else. They were all young. They were all ambitious. They were all, in their different ways, trying to find something to believe in. And then came Berlin. In 1933, Emil Cioran was awarded a scholarship from the Humboldt Foundation to study philosophy in Germany. He was 22 years old. The insomnia had by now become a permanent condition, something he no longer expected to escape, something that had shaped his thinking and his temperament into forms that would last for the rest of his life. He arrived in Berlin in the autumn of that year, just months after Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany, and what he found there thrilled him. We need to be careful here. We need to understand what it meant for a young Romanian intellectual to arrive in Germany in 1933, what he would have seen, what he would have felt, what the atmosphere was like in those first months of the Nazi regime. Because the horror that came later, the camps, the genocide, the industrial machinery of death, was not yet visible. What was visible was energy. What was visible was movement, purpose, certainty. A nation that had been humiliated and broken and mired in economic catastrophe was suddenly on its feet again, marching, believing, alive with a sense of mission that seemed to sweep everything before it. Cioran wrote home with admiration. Not cautious admiration, not the hedged approval of a detached observer, but the wide-eyed enthusiasm of a young man who felt he was witnessing something extraordinary. He praised Hitler. He praised the fury, the will, the refusal of compromise, the sheer vitality of the new Germany. He saw in the Nazi movement something that answered to his own desperate hunger for meaning, a politics of intensity, of commitment, of burning away the comfortable lies of liberal democracy and replacing them with something harder, purer, more alive. Was it the insomnia? Was it the long years of sleeplessness? The exhaustion that makes everything seem both distant and hyper-real? The strange lucidity that comes when you have not closed your eyes for days? Or was it simply the spirit of the age, the seductions that so many young intellectuals across Europe fell for in those years, the sense that history was moving and you had to move with it or be swept aside? Whatever it was, Cioran did not resist it. He gave himself over to it, and when he returned to Romania he brought that fire with him. The Iron Guard was waiting. You have perhaps heard of fascism in Italy, in Germany, in Spain. You may know less about what it looked like in Romania, because Romania is a small country on the edge of Europe and its history has been overshadowed by its larger neighbours. But the Iron Guard, the Legion of the Archangel Michael, to give it its original name, was one of the strangest and most terrible fascist movements of the 20th century. It combined extreme nationalism with orthodox Christian mysticism, anti-Semitism with a cult of death and martyrdom, political violence with an almost ecstatic spirituality that made its members believe they were fighting not just a political struggle, but a cosmic one. The Guard's founder was a man named Corneliu Zelea Codreanu, a charismatic figure with a thin face and burning eyes who spoke of purifying Romania of its enemies, of creating a new man through suffering and sacrifice, of dying for the nation as the highest form of devotion. His followers wore green shirts and swore oaths of blood loyalty. They sang hymns and prayed together before they went out to murder Jews and political opponents. They believed, with a fervour that is difficult for modern readers to comprehend, that they were doing God's work. And Emil Cioran, the sleepless philosopher, the young man who had already decided that existence was a kind of illness, threw himself into their cause. He did not join the Guard formally, as far as we know. He did not march in the streets or participate in the violence directly, but he wrote. He wrote articles praising the movement, praising Codreanu, praising the energy and the will and the refusal to accept the decadence of the present. He wrote a book called The Transfiguration of Romania, published in 1936, that was filled with nationalist passion and contained passages about the Jewish population of his country that make for almost unbearable reading today. He spoke of Jews as a foreign element, as a threat to the Romanian soul, as something that needed to be dealt with if Romania was to become what it was meant to be. These were not passing remarks. These were not footnotes buried in academic prose. These were central to the argument of the book, to the vision of national renewal that Cioran was proposing. He wanted Romania to become something different, something harder, something willing to use violence and exclusion in the service of a higher purpose. And he said so, clearly in his own name, in a book that was widely read and widely praised by people who shared his views. How do we understand this? How do we hold in our minds the man who would later write with such delicacy about the uselessness of conviction, the danger of belief, the wisdom of resignation, and the young firebrand who celebrated a movement that would go on to participate in some of the worst atrocities of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe? One answer, The answer Cioran himself would offer in later years is that he was young, that he was mad with sleeplessness, drunk on ideas, swept up in a moment of historical fever that burned through an entire generation, that the young man who wrote those things was someone he no longer recognised, a stranger whose words filled him with shame. He said this in private letters. He said it in interviews conducted decades later, when scholars began to dig through his past. He never quite said it publicly, loudly, in a way that would put the matter to rest, but he said it. Another answer, harder and perhaps more honest, is that the later Cioran was not so different from the young one as he wanted to believe. The philosophy of despair, the rejection of hope, the insistence that all human projects end in failure and all beliefs lead to violence. This can be read as wisdom, as the hard-won peace of a man who has seen too much. But it can also be read as a way of avoiding responsibility. If nothing matters, if all causes are equally futile, then the cause you once believed in does not require accounting. It was just another form of the universal error, another proof of the theorem you have been proving all along. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The truth is probably that Emil Cioran was a complicated man who did terrible things with his pen and then spent the rest of his life trying to become someone who could not have done them. Whether he succeeded is the question that hangs over everything else he wrote. The Iron Guard rose and fell in the chaos of the late 1930s and early 1940s. Codreanu was arrested and murdered by the Romanian government in 1938, strangled in the back of a police van, his death framed as an escape attempt. The Guard briefly came to power in alliance with a military dictatorship, and in January 1941, during a failed coup, its members unleashed a pogrom in Bucharest that left over 100 Jews dead. Some of them hung on meat hooks in a slaughterhouse, their bodies labelled like cattle. This was the movement Cioran had celebrated. These were the people whose energy and will he had admired. He was in Paris by then, having received a scholarship from the French Institute in Bucharest in 1937. The scholarship was supposed to be temporary, a year or two of study before returning home. But Cioran never went back. The war came. Romania fell under Nazi influence, then Soviet influence. The world he had known disappeared. And Cioran stayed in Paris, in a series of cheap hotels and borrowed rooms, slowly becoming someone else. In 1940, before the fall of France, he gave a broadcast on Romanian radio praising the memory of Codreanu. This was his last public statement on behalf of the cause. After that, silence. After that, Paris and the French language and the long, slow work of building a new self out of the ruins of the old. The Rue de l'Odéon is in the 6th arrondissement, in the Latin Quarter, in a neighbourhood of bookshops and cafes and old stone buildings that have seen centuries of students and writers and dreamers pass through their doors. It is the kind of street that makes you believe in Paris, in the romance of the life of the mind, in the possibility that you could live in a tiny room and eat cheap food and think great thoughts, and it would all somehow be worthwhile. Sylvia Beach had her bookshop there, Shakespeare and Company, in the years between the wars. James Joyce had walked these pavements. The air itself seemed saturated with literature. And in a 6th-floor garret so small that visitors had to stand because there was no room to sit, Emil Cioran began to write in French. This was not easy. French was his 4th language, after Romanian, German and Hungarian. He had learned it late, imperfectly, and he said that writing in it was like fighting an enemy, like forcing his thoughts through a medium that resisted them at every turn. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the resistance was what he wanted. A language you have to struggle with is a language that slows you down, that makes you choose every word carefully, that strips away the easy fluencies that let you say things you do not really mean. Romanian had been the language of his passion, his certainty, his terrible mistakes. French would be the language of his doubt. He worked on his first French book for years. It was published in 1949 under the title Précis de décomposition, a short history of decay. The prose was extraordinary. French critics who read it could not believe it had been written by a foreigner. It was precise, musical, aphoristic, full of a dark wit that made even the bleakest observations somehow bearable. And the message was clear. Everything falls apart. Civilizations rise and decay. Ideas seduce and betray. The only wisdom is the wisdom of refusal, of stepping back from the carousel of belief and watching it spin without you. Gone was the nationalism. Gone was the fury. Gone was the young man who had celebrated violence and will and the purification of the nation. In his place was someone who seemed to have given up on all of it, who wrote about the uselessness of commitment with the weariness of someone who had committed too much and been burned. Was this transformation real? Or was it simply a costume, a French disguise for a man who could not bear to look at what he had been? The answer matters. It matters because Cioran became, in the decades after the war, one of the most admired writers in the French language. His books were translated, studied, quoted. He was offered prizes and refused them. He was offered professorships and refused them too. He said the writer who accepts honours deserves none. He lived in that tiny apartment with Simone Bouet, a woman he had met in the 1940s, and who would stay with him for the rest of his life, and he walked the streets of Paris at night, still unable to sleep, still filling notebooks with thoughts about the futility of everything. He became friends with Samuel Beckett, another exile, another man who wrote about the impossibility of going on and then went on anyway. They would meet for walks and talk about nothing in particular, two men who had made art out of silence and refusal. Beckett, it is said, eventually grew tired of Cioran. There was only so much despair even Beckett could take. But for a while they were kindred spirits, two voices in the darkness, each in his own way saying that there was no point and yet somehow making the saying of it beautiful. And through all of this, the past was waiting. The past was there in the archives, in the Romanian editions of the books Cioran had written in his 20s, in the articles and broadcasts that had not been translated that he hoped had been forgotten. When new editions of his early work were prepared, passages disappeared. The most offensive lines about Jews were softened or cut entirely. The explicit praise of fascism was toned down. Cioran was editing his own history, trying to make the young man he had been into someone less frightening, less recognisable, less damning to the old man he had become. Some of this he admitted. In interviews late in his life, when scholars had begun to dig and the questions could no longer be avoided, he would speak of the shame, the madness, the fever of youth. He would say that he did not recognise himself in those pages. He would say that the sleep deprivation had made him crazy, that he had been a different person then, that he regretted everything. But he never issued a public apology. He never wrote an essay taking full responsibility. He never stood up in the clear light of day and said, "I was wrong, I did harm, I am sorry to the people I harmed." And so the question remains. The question that hangs over every beautiful sentence he ever wrote in French, every aphorism about the impossibility of belief, every quiet confession of exhaustion and surrender. Was this wisdom? Was this the peace that comes after you have seen what conviction can do and resolved never to be convinced of anything again? Or was it evasion? Was it a very long, very elegant way of not looking at the thing he had done? In the garret on the Rue de l'Odéon the nights were still long. The city outside the window never quite slept, but it quieted, the way cities do, into the small sounds of after midnight. A distant siren, a conversation ending on a corner, the bell of some church marking an hour that most people would not remember, and Emil Cioran sat with his notebooks, writing sentences that seemed to come from somewhere beyond hope or despair, somewhere where the only thing left was the act of making words out of darkness. But to understand the shape of that darkness, to understand why he sat there night after night with no hope of rescue and no desire for it, we have to go back further than Paris, further than the war, further than the young man who threw himself into the arms of fascism and then spent 50 years pretending he had never done so. We have to go back to the place where the insomnia began. Rashinari was a village of perhaps 2,000 souls, set in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains in a region called Transylvania, which was at that time, in 1911, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It would become Romanian 8 years later, after the empire collapsed, but the village itself would remain much the same. A cluster of stone and wood houses, an Orthodox church with an onion dome that caught the light of early morning, fields that climbed the lower slopes of the mountains, and beyond them, the dark line of the forest that seemed to go on forever. Emil Cioran was born there on the 8th of April, in the house of the village priest. His father, Emilian Cioran, was a man of faith and order, a servant of the church who walked each Sunday to the altar to perform the ancient liturgy, who baptized the children of the village and buried its dead, who believed in the rituals that had sustained his people for centuries. His mother, whose maiden name was Elvira Comuniciu, was by all accounts a warmer presence, though Cioran would later write about her with a kind of distant bewilderment, as if she were a creature from another world whose kindness he could not quite comprehend. The village was, by the standards of the time and place, not unusual. Life moved in the old rhythms, planting and harvest, fast and feast, the turning of the liturgical year that gave shape to days that might otherwise have seemed shapeless. The mountains were always there, rising to the south and west, and the people of Rushinari lived in their shadow, the way people have always lived in the shadows of mountains, aware that something larger than themselves was watching, something ancient and unmoved. This landscape would stay with Cioran for the rest of his life. Even in Paris, even in the depths of his most abstract pessimism, he would sometimes speak of the mountains of his childhood as if they were the only real thing he had ever known. But something was wrong from the beginning. Or perhaps wrong is not the word. Something was different. The boy who grew up in the priest's house was not like the other children of the village. He was sickly, prone to fevers and nervous ailments that kept him in bed while the other boys ran in the fields. He was anxious in a way that the village had no language for, filled with fears that seemed to come from nowhere and attach themselves to everything. He was intelligent, certainly, but his intelligence had an edge to it, a restlessness that made the small world of Rushinari feel like a prison even before he knew what a prison was. And then there was the matter of his faith, or rather, the slow dissolution of it. To grow up as the son of an Orthodox priest is to grow up inside a world that is, in some sense, complete. The liturgy explains the year. The icons explain the cosmos. The rituals of birth and death and everything between are woven into a fabric that holds meaning steady, that tells you who you are and where you stand in relation to God and eternity. For many children this is a comfort. For the young Emil Cioran, it became a kind of torment. He felt the beauty of the church, the incense and the chanting and the gold light falling on the faces of the saints. But he also felt, somewhere beneath it, the cold draught of doubt, the sense that these words and gestures pointed towards something that was not there, or that was there but did not care, or that was there and cared but in a way that made human caring seem like a cruel joke. He never quite lost his fascination with religion, even in his most atheistic moments, even in the Paris years when he wrote that God was the most interesting character in fiction and nothing more. There was something in him that kept circling back to the church of his childhood, to the sense that if meaning existed anywhere, it existed in those rituals, and if it did not exist there, then it did not exist at all. The faith of his father became for him not a foundation, but a wound, a place where something had been cut out and never quite healed. The family moved when Emil was 10 years old, from Rushinari to Sibiu, a larger town some 20 kilometres to the north. Sibiu was an old Saxon city, built by German settlers in the 12th century, and it had a different character from the Romanian villages that surrounded it, more urban, more cosmopolitan, with Lutheran churches and Gothic spires and a central square that could have been lifted from Bavaria. For the boy from the mountain village, it was a revelation. Here there were books, more books than he had ever seen. Here there were ideas floating in the air, conversations about philosophy and politics, and the great questions that seemed so much more interesting than the small questions of village life. Here, too, there were other people who felt as strange as he did, other young men and women who did not fit into the world they had been given, and were trying to imagine another one. Cioran attended the local lyceum and quickly established himself as a brilliant and difficult student. He read voraciously, philosophy above all, but also literature, history, theology. He discovered Nietzsche, who would remain the most important influence on his thought for the rest of his life, and he discovered Schopenhauer, whose pessimism gave him a vocabulary for feelings he had carried since childhood but never been able to name. He discovered Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, Pascal and the German mystics. He read as if his life depended on it, which in some sense it did. The books were a way out of the trap of his own mind, a way of discovering that other people had thought these thoughts before him, and survived. But the real catastrophe, the event that would shape everything that came after, began around the age of 17 and reached its full force by the time he was 20. He stopped sleeping. Not in the ordinary way that young men sometimes have trouble sleeping. Too much coffee, too much excitement, the racing mind of adolescence. This was something else. This was a complete and total breakdown of the mechanism that allows human beings to rest. Night after night he would lie in bed, his body exhausted, his mind unable to stop, watching the hours go by in a state of hyper-alert misery that made the world seem unreal and unbearable. He would walk the streets of Sibiu in the small hours, the medieval city empty and silent around him, the cobblestones wet with dew, the shuttered windows of the houses like closed eyes that would not open to help him. He was alone in a way that is difficult to describe, alone with consciousness itself, forced to experience every moment without the relief of forgetting, without the small death that sleep provides and that makes waking life tolerable. He wrote about this later, in the book that would become his first significant work, a text called On the Heights of Despair, that he composed at the age of 22 in a frenzy of sleepless nights. The insomnia, he said, had destroyed him and created him simultaneously. It had stripped away every illusion, every comfortable belief, every hope that things might somehow work out. It had left him with nothing but the raw fact of existence experienced not as a gift, but as an imposition, a burden that no one had asked him to carry and that he could not set down. The book is remarkable, passionate, chaotic, written in a Romanian that blazes and staggers and screams. It is the work of a young man in genuine extremity, a young man who is not performing despair but drowning in it, and it contains, already, the seeds of everything Cioran would later become: the aphoristic style, the obsession with death and futility, the strange beauty that can be made from the admission that nothing matters. But it also contains something else. It contains a hunger, a desperate need for something to believe in, something that might fill the void where sleep and faith and hope had once been. Nietzsche had spoken of the will to power, of the Übermensch who creates his own values in a world without God. Cioran read this not as philosophy, but as prophecy. If nothing matters, then what remains is force. If the old world is dead, then the new world will belong to those who have the strength to seize it. If existence is suffering, then perhaps the only dignity lies in transforming that suffering into action, into violence, into the blind forward motion of a people or a nation that refuses to accept its fate. This was the mood of Europe in the early 1930s. The Great War had shattered the old certainties. The Depression had impoverished the continent. Democracy seemed weak, liberalism exhausted, the future up for grabs. In Germany, a new movement was rising, one that promised to sweep away the debris of the past and build something fierce and vital in its place. In Italy, Mussolini had already shown what a small group of committed men could do if they were willing to use force without apology. And in Romania, a country that had doubled in size after the war but still felt uncertain of its place in the world, a movement was forming that drew on both German and Italian models but added something distinctly its own, a mystical nationalism rooted in Orthodox Christianity, in the soil and the blood of the Romanian people, in the idea that the nation was not just a political entity but a spiritual one, and that its enemies were not just foreign powers but the corrupting influences within. The Iron Guard, it was called, or sometimes the Legion of the Archangel Michael. Its founder was Corneliu Zelea Codreanu, a charismatic law student with dark eyes and a gift for speaking to crowds. Codreanu was handsome in the way that fascist leaders so often were, tall and lean, with a face that seemed to belong on an icon. He spoke of sacrifice and redemption, of the Romanian soul that had been polluted by foreigners and would be purified by struggle. He organised his followers into nests and legions, gave them uniforms and songs, led them on marches through the countryside where they would stop in villages to help with the harvest or to pray in the local church. The movement combined the worst elements of European fascism, the violence, the anti-Semitism, the worship of death and the leader, with a peculiarly Romanian strain of orthodox mysticism that made it seem, to some young men, not like a political party, but like a religious revival. Emil Cioran was one of those young men. He joined the Guard, or at least he gave himself to it in spirit. He wrote articles praising Codreanu, praising the energy and purity of the movement, praising what he saw as the authentic expression of Romanian vitality against the corruption and decadence of the old order. He travelled to Berlin in 1933 on a scholarship from the Humboldt Foundation, and there he witnessed something that thrilled him: the new Germany, the Reich that was just beginning to take shape, the torchlight parades and the mass rallies, and the sense that history was moving, that something was finally happening after years of stagnation and despair. He wrote letters home filled with admiration for Adolf Hitler. Not subtle admiration, not the grudging respect of a critic, genuine enthusiasm. He called Hitler one of the great figures of European history. He praised the vitality, the decisiveness, the willingness to act that he saw in the Nazi movement. He contrasted it with what he perceived as the weakness and indecision of democracy, the endless talking and compromising that led nowhere. Here, at last, was action. Here was a force that knew what it wanted and would not be stopped. When he returned to Romania in 1936, he threw himself into the work of the Iron Guard with renewed energy. He published The Transfiguration of Romania, a book that called for a radical remaking of Romanian society along nationalist lines. The book is painful to read today, not because it is stupid — Cioran was never stupid — but because it is brilliant in the service of something terrible. He wrote about the Romanian people with a mixture of love and contempt, praising their spiritual depths while condemning what he saw as their historical passivity, their failure to become a great nation. He called for a creative fury that would transform the country, sweep away the deadwood, create something new and powerful and pure. And in several passages he wrote about the Jews. He wrote about them as a foreign presence in the Romanian body, as a people who had contributed nothing to Romanian culture and who were, by their very nature, incompatible with the Romanian soul. These passages are not long, but they are there, and they say what they say. They are not the raving of a street agitator, but the considered prose of an intellectual who had thought about these matters and reached conclusions that he was willing to put into print. There is no way to soften this. There is no way to explain it away. The young Emil Cioran, the insomniac mystic of despair, the future sage of existential resignation, was in his 20s a committed fascist and an anti-Semite who lent his considerable talents to a movement that would, given the chance, have done in Romania what the Nazis did in Germany. The Iron Guard never got that chance fully. Romanian politics were too chaotic, the Guard's own violence too undisciplined, the war too disastrous. But they got close enough to leave a trail of corpses behind them, including the bodies of Jews killed in pogroms that the Guard either organised or enthusiastically joined. Cioran was not a killer. He did not personally murder anyone. He was a writer, an intellectual, a man of ideas. But ideas have consequences. Words have weight. When a gifted young thinker lends his voice to a movement of death, he becomes complicit in what that movement does. This is not a difficult moral calculation. It is one of the simplest moral calculations there is, and yet, in Berlin, in those years when he was discovering Hitler and praising the new Germany, Cioran was also walking the streets at night, still unable to sleep, still tormented by the consciousness that would not give him rest. He was writing in his notebooks about the futility of everything, about the impossibility of finding meaning in a world where God was dead and sleep would not come. He was suffering, genuinely suffering, in a way that he would describe for the rest of his life as the formative experience of his existence. The insomnia had not stopped when the politics began. The despair had not lifted when the enthusiasm arrived. They coexisted, the darkness and the fury, the hopelessness and the conviction. And this is perhaps the strangest and most unsettling thing about the young Cioran, that he could feel the emptiness of everything and still throw himself into a cause, that he could doubt all meaning and still believe in the meaning of the nation, that he could write about the impossibility of action and still choose to act in the service of evil. It is possible to hold two contradictory truths at once, and the young Cioran held them. He knew that everything was meaningless, and he believed that Romania must be reborn. He understood that all systems of thought were illusions, and he committed himself to a system of thought that promised to remake the world. He wrote in his private notebooks that suicide was always an option, that life was an imposition no one had asked for, and then he walked to his desk and wrote articles praising a movement that believed in struggle, in sacrifice, in the purifying violence of collective will. How a man can contain such contradictions is not a question that admits an easy answer. But humans contain multitudes of contradiction every day, and the young Cioran was nothing if not human. What the politics gave him perhaps was relief. The insomnia had stripped him of the ordinary defences that most people carry against the weight of being alive. When you cannot sleep, when night after night you lie awake staring at the ceiling or walking the empty streets while the rest of the world is unconscious and at peace, you begin to feel that you are somehow outside of life, observing it from a distance that you cannot close. The loneliness of insomnia is not like other loneliness. It is existential, it is relentless, and it has no cure except the cure you cannot have, which is sleep. The politics offered something that felt like an antidote to that loneliness. The Iron Guard was not just a political movement, it was a mystical brotherhood, a communion of believers who shared a vision of national resurrection that was almost religious in its fervour. To be part of it was to be part of something larger than yourself, something that promised to transform not just society, but the souls of those who gave themselves to it. For a young man drowning in isolation and meaninglessness, that promise must have been intoxicating. This does not excuse anything. Nothing excuses anything. But it helps explain how a brilliant young philosopher could end up writing propaganda for fascists, how a man who would later be celebrated for his skepticism of all ideologies could once have believed in this particular ideology with all his heart. He was looking for something to fill the emptiness that the insomnia had carved out of him. He found the Iron Guard, and for a few years it was enough. The Guard itself was a strange phenomenon, difficult for anyone outside Romania in those years to fully understand. It was founded in 1927 by a man named Corneliu Zelea Codreanu, a charismatic leader with a mystical bent who dressed in the white peasant clothing of Romanian tradition and spoke of the nation's spiritual mission in terms that blended Orthodox Christianity with a cult of death and sacrifice. The Guard's members called themselves legionaries, and they practiced rituals that would have seemed bizarre to the more bureaucratic fascists of Italy, or the industrial-minded National Socialists of Germany. They swore blood oaths. They venerated their dead as martyrs. They believed that they were engaged not just in a political struggle, but in a spiritual war for the soul of Romania. Violence was not a means to an end for the Iron Guard. It was a sacrament. They assassinated political opponents with a regularity that alarmed even their nominal allies in the Romanian right. They organised pogroms that combined religious fervour with murderous efficiency, and through it all they maintained a strange romanticism, a sense that they were the chosen instruments of a higher purpose. Cioran was drawn to this romanticism. He was drawn to Codreanu, who he later described as the most interesting man he had ever met, even as he acknowledged that Codreanu was also something like a beautiful disaster, a figure of tremendous personal magnetism whose ideas were ultimately catastrophic. There is a photograph from this period that shows Cioran standing with other young intellectuals of the Guard, looking serious and committed, his face still soft with youth. He was 25, 26, 27 years old. He thought he was helping to build something that would last, something that would transform his country and give meaning to the suffering of his people. He was wrong, of course. He was catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. But at the time, he did not know this, or if he knew it somewhere in the depths of himself, he chose not to listen to that knowing. By 1938, the tide was beginning to turn. The Romanian government, alarmed by the Guard's violence and its growing power, began a campaign of suppression. Codreanu was arrested on trumped-up charges and then, along with 13 other legionary leaders, was strangled to death by police officers while supposedly being transferred between prisons. The official story was that they had been shot while trying to escape. No one believed it. The Guard, already prone to violence, became more violent still. They responded with assassinations, with bombings, with acts of terror that only deepened the government's determination to destroy them. By the time the war came to Romania, the Guard was a hunted movement, its leadership dead or scattered, its mystical nationalism bleeding out on the altar of political reality. Cioran watched all of this from a distance. By 1937, he had left Romania on a scholarship to study in Paris. The official reason was academic. He was supposed to be pursuing philosophical studies at the Sorbonne, but the reality was more complicated. He was tired. The insomnia had not relented. The enthusiasm he had felt for the Guard was beginning to feel hollow, or at least heavy, and Paris offered the possibility of escape from a country that seemed to be tearing itself apart. He arrived in the city that would become his home for the rest of his life, and he found it cold, sophisticated, indifferent to the passionate nationalism that had consumed him in Bucharest. The French did not care about the transformation of Romania. They barely knew where Romania was. And slowly, in the quiet of that indifference, something in Cioran began to change. He did not renounce the Guard immediately. He continued to correspond with friends in the movement, continued to speak well of Codreanu even after Codreanu's murder. When the Guard briefly came to power in 1940, in a chaotic coalition with the military dictator Ion Antonescu, Cioran gave a radio address in their defence, one of the last public gestures of his political period. But by then the fire was going out. The Guards' brief moment in power was marked by more violence, more pogroms, more chaos, and it ended after just a few months when Antonescu, tired of their instability, crushed them with military force. Cioran was in Paris, listening to the news from home, and something in him was already beginning to close. The war years were strange and silent. Cioran stayed in Paris through the German occupation, living in the cheap hotels and rented rooms that would become his permanent mode of existence. He wrote little that survives from this period. He was learning French, laboriously, painfully, because he had decided that Romanian was somehow contaminated for him now, that he could not continue to write in the language in which he had praised the Guard and condemned the Jews. French was clean, French was neutral. French was a language in which he could start again, though starting again meant starting from nothing, meant becoming like a child who must learn to name the world all over. The war ended, the newsreels came, the camps were opened, and the world saw what had been done in the name of the ideologies that Cioran had once praised. It is impossible to know exactly what he felt in those months of revelation, when the photographs emerged and the testimonies began, when the scale of the horror became impossible to ignore or explain away. He never wrote about it directly. He never recorded a moment of reckoning in which he confronted the connection between his words and the piles of corpses, between his articles praising national purity and the implementation of that purity's final logic. But something happened in those years, something internal and private and complete. By the time the war was over, the man who had been Emil Cioran the fascist, Emil Cioran the nationalist, Emil Cioran the anti-Semite, was gone. In his place was someone else entirely. The transformation was not instantaneous. Nothing human ever is. But by the late 1940s, Cioran had settled into the mode that would define him for the rest of his life. He lived in a small apartment on the Rue de l'Odéon with Simone Bouet, a woman he had met shortly after arriving in Paris, and who would remain his companion until his death. They never married. They never had children. They lived in a kind of austere domesticity, their relationship marked by long silences and separate bedrooms, and a mutual understanding that seemed to require no elaboration. Simone was a schoolteacher, practical and grounded, and she provided the stability that allowed Cioran to retreat into his world of thought and writing. He needed very little: a room, a desk, his notebooks, his walks through the city at night. The insomnia had not relented. It would never relent. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped trying to cure it, and had instead built his life around it, as one might build a house around a boulder that cannot be moved. In French he began to write the books that would make him famous, though famous is perhaps too strong a word for a writer whose work would always remain somewhat marginal, admired by a devoted few but never reaching the broad audience of a Sartre or a Camus. His first French book, A Short History of Decay, appeared in 1949, and it was like nothing the French literary world had seen. It was a book of fragments, of aphorisms, of short bitter essays that circled around themes of despair, futility, and the impossibility of finding meaning in a universe that had no meaning to offer. The prose was exquisite. Even those who disagreed with everything Cioran said had to admit that he said it beautifully. He had fought the French language like an enemy, and emerged from the fight with a style of crystalline precision, each sentence polished until it gleamed, each idea compressed to its essential weight. The book was pessimistic in a way that went beyond pessimism, nihilistic in a way that transcended nihilism. It offered no solutions, no hopes, no consolations. It simply described what the author saw when he looked at the world, and what he saw was ruin. The reviews were mixed, but the book found its readers, and Cioran, to his own surprise, found that he had a second career, a second language, a second life. He continued to write, slowly, laboriously, each book taking years to complete, because he refused to publish anything that did not meet his exacting standards. The temptation to exist, history and utopia, the fall into time, the trouble with being born. The titles alone tell you something about his preoccupations. They are not the titles of a happy man. They are not even the titles of a man who believes in happiness. They are the titles of someone for whom existence itself is a problem, a burden, a question that admits no satisfying answer, and yet there was joy in him, or something like joy. Those who knew him in his later years describe a man of tremendous wit, capable of devastating humour about his own despair, a conversationalist who could hold a room in thrall even while insisting that conversation was meaningless and rooms were prisons. He loved to walk, he loved to argue, he loved to sit in the cafes of Saint-Germain-des-Prés and drink coffee and watch the parade of human folly pass by. The despair was real, but it coexisted with an appetite for life that his philosophy could never quite explain away. This is the paradox that runs through all of Cioran's later work. The man who wrote endlessly about the appeal of suicide was also a man who woke up each morning, or each afternoon given the insomnia, and went on living, went on writing, went on engaging with a world he claimed to find unbearable. Either he was a hypocrite, which is possible, or he understood something about despair that his readers did not always grasp. That despair does not preclude action, that the acknowledgement of futility does not require surrender, that one can find life meaningless and still choose to live it. What he did not do, in all those years of French prose and Parisian exile, was speak publicly about what he had been. The Romanian books gradually faded from view, untranslated, unmentioned. When interviewers asked about his youth, he was evasive, deflecting questions with aphorisms or outright refusal. When scholars pressed for details, he changed the subject. The young fascist had become a private shame, something to be buried rather than confronted, something that existed only in old archives and the memories of those who had known him then. He didn't deny what he had done. He was too intelligent for simple denial, but he declined to elaborate, to explain, to justify. He simply fell silent on the matter and let the silence do its work. This silence was its own kind of strategy. By refusing to address his past directly, Cioran allowed his later work to stand on its own terms, uncontaminated by the questions that would inevitably arise if readers knew what had come before. The aphorisms about futility and resignation could be read as universal wisdom, rather than as the specific production of a man who had once believed in something and been burned by that belief. The refusal of ideology in his mature work could seem like a philosophical position, rather than a personal response to a particular ideological catastrophe. His whole second career, his whole French reputation, was built on a foundation of strategic forgetting. And for many years, it worked. The French literary establishment embraced him as one of their own, a Romanian who had chosen their language and mastered it, a European intellectual of the old school who refused prizes and professorships with a disdain that only increased his mystique. He was photographed with Beckett, with Ionesco, with the great figures of post-war Paris. He gave interviews in which he spoke eloquently about meaninglessness and smiled his thin, ironic smile. He became, in a modest way, a sage, the sage of futility, the prophet of permanent doubt. And all the while, locked in archives in Bucharest, the early books sat unread, their passages about Jews and national purity gathering dust. The dam did not break until after his death, when scholars began to excavate his Romanian period with the tools of archival research. What they found was worse than many had expected. It was not just the transfiguration of Romania, which had been known about in outline even during Cioran's lifetime. It was the full range of his journalism from the 1930s, the radio addresses, the private letters in which he expressed admiration for the Guards' violence and contempt for its enemies. The picture that emerged was of a young man who had not merely flirted with fascism, but embraced it fully, who had not merely made a few unfortunate statements, but had committed himself to a movement of death with all the passion of his formidable intellect. The revelations sparked a debate that continues to this day, a debate about whether Cioran's later work can be separated from his earlier sins, whether the wisdom of the French books is contaminated by the madness of the Romanian ones, whether a man can truly change or whether change is just another form of concealment. There are those who say the later Cioran was the real one, the one that mattered, and that the young fascist was a kind of chrysalis that had to be shed before the mature thinker could emerge. There are those who say the opposite, that the later Cioran was a mask, a performance of resignation that allowed him to avoid confronting what he had done, and that his famous pessimism was nothing more than a sophisticated form of evasion. And there are those who say both things are true at once, that he was genuinely transformed and genuinely evasive, that he meant every word of his despair, and also used that despair to avoid accountability, that humans are complicated enough to contain all these contradictions without resolving any of them. What we know is this: he never apologized publicly. He never made a statement of contrition that could be quoted, studied, judged. When his early writings were discussed in his presence, he would say things like, "I was mad," or "I was another person," or "Youth is no excuse, but it is an explanation." These are not nothing. They acknowledge something, some break between the man who wrote those words and the man who sat in his Paris apartment surrounded by books. But they are not enough for those who believe that public sins require public reckoning, that silence is complicity with one's former self, that the refusal to speak is itself a kind of speech. The debate will never end because Cioran is dead and can no longer add to the record. He took his silence with him into that final forgetting, into the Alzheimer's that claimed his last years and erased even his memory of what he had done, what he had written, who he had been. By the end, he did not recognise Simone, did not recognise his apartment, didn't recognise the language in which he had built his second life. The great insomniac finally found a kind of peace, though not the kind he had sought. His mind simply stopped working, and the questions stopped with it. He died in June of 1995 in a hospital in Paris, and they buried him in Montparnasse, near Beckett and Baudelaire and all the other literary dead who had made that cemetery their final home. The stone above him gives his name and his dates and nothing else. It does not say what he believed or what he regretted. It does not say whether he was finally at peace. The cemetery at Montparnasse is a strange place to end a story, though perhaps not for Cioran. He had spent so much of his life among the dead, reading them, arguing with them, measuring himself against their failures and their silences. Now he lies among them, one more name on a stone, one more set of dates that mean everything to someone and nothing to most. The tourists who wander through Montparnasse are usually looking for Sartre, or Beauvoir, or sometimes Beckett. They pass Cioran's grave without stopping. He would have approved. He had always said that fame was a misunderstanding, that to be known was to be known wrongly, that the only honest relationship a writer could have with the public was one of mutual indifference. But the grave, for all its silence, does not close the question. It only marks the place where the question was deposited, like something too heavy to carry any further. What are we to make of Emil Cioran? What are we to do with a man who wrote so beautifully about despair and so badly about his fellow human beings? What does it mean that the same mind could produce both the transfiguration of Romania and the trouble with being born? That the same hand could sign both a defence of the Iron Guard and an aphorism about the impossibility of believing in anything at all? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that anyone who reads Cioran seriously must eventually face, and they do not have easy answers. Perhaps they do not have answers at all, only positions, stances, choices about what to emphasise and what to set aside. Some readers make those choices consciously, deciding that they can separate the art from the artist, the late work from the early life. Others find that they cannot, that every sentence of the French books is shadowed by the memory of what came before, that the elegance of the prose feels less like wisdom than like camouflage. And still others oscillate between these positions, drawn to the work despite their reservations, repelled by the life despite their admiration, never quite settling on a verdict. What is remarkable, in a way, is that Cioran anticipated all of this. He knew better than anyone that his past would catch up with him. He knew that the things he had written in Romanian would eventually surface, would eventually be read, would eventually become part of his story whether he wanted them to or not. He was not naive about history or memory or the persistence of the written word. He had made his career, after all, out of the observation that nothing ever really goes away, that the past is not past, that we carry our former selves like parasites feeding on our present. He must have known that his own former self was feeding on him too, that the young fascist was still in there somewhere, buried but not erased, waiting to be discovered, and yet he chose silence. Not the silence of denial. He admitted freely when pressed that he had been wrong, that he had been mad, that he had believed things that were monstrous. But the silence of refusal, the refusal to make a formal reckoning, to write the essay of contrition that his critics demanded, to submit himself to the ritual of public apology that might have, if not absolved him, at least demonstrated his willingness to be judged. He would not do it. He said, near the end of his lucid years, that to apologise publicly would be to make a spectacle of his shame, to turn his guilt into a performance, to reduce the genuine horror of what he had believed to a transaction in which he paid some nominal price and was then permitted to go on as before. He said that a real apology would require him to become someone else entirely, to disown not just his opinions but his entire youth, to pretend that the man who had written those things was a stranger when in fact that man was himself, continuous with himself, connected by memory and body, and the unbroken thread of consciousness that runs from the child in Rashinari to the old man in Paris. He could not do it. He would not pretend that the break was clean. This is either integrity or evasion, depending on how you look at it. It is either an honest acknowledgement of the messiness of human identity, the impossibility of truly separating who we were from who we are, or it is a sophisticated excuse for avoiding accountability, a way of using philosophical complexity to escape moral simplicity. Cioran himself would have said that it was both. He was always suspicious of clean categories, of the either-or, of the demand that people be one thing or another. He believed, and this is present in nearly everything he wrote after Romania, that the human condition is defined by contradiction, that we are all of us multiple and incoherent, that the search for consistency is a form of self-deception. Whether he believed this because it was true or because it was convenient, because it reflected the actual nature of human beings or because it allowed him to live with himself, is another question that cannot be finally answered. What can be said is that the silence had consequences. It allowed the work to speak for itself, which meant that for decades the French books circulated without the shadow of the Romanian past, reaching readers who had no idea what their author had believed in his 20s. This was, in a sense, what Cioran wanted. He wanted to be judged by the work and nothing else, wanted the aphorisms to stand alone, wanted the reader to encounter his pessimism without knowing its origins. But it was also a deception, or at least an omission, a withholding of information that would have changed how the work was read. When the archives finally opened, when the Romanian journalism was translated and analysed, many readers felt betrayed. They had trusted a voice that had not been fully honest with them. They had taken comfort in a philosophy of despair that turned out to have emerged from something much darker than mere existential gloom. The bleakness that had seemed universal, timeless, detached from any particular politics, was revealed to have roots in a very specific soil, in the blood and mysticism and violence of interwar fascism. Some readers could not forgive that. Some felt that they had been complicit, unwittingly, in a kind of laundering, that by reading and admiring the late Cioran they had helped him escape from the early one. Others reached a different conclusion. They said that the late work was not a disguise but a response, that the pessimism of the French books was precisely Cioran's way of reckoning with what he had done, that his insistence on the futility of all belief was an answer to his own former belief, a kind of inoculation against the very madness that had once possessed him. On this reading, the aphorisms about the danger of conviction, about the seductiveness of certainty, about the violence that lurks in every ideal, were not evasions but confessions, indirect acknowledgments that he knew exactly where certainty could lead because he had followed it there himself. The man who wrote that every idea that triumphs becomes suspect, that to believe in something is already to be on the path to cruelty, that the only honest position is one of permanent doubt. This man was not hiding from his past but metabolizing it, turning his own failure into a warning, offering his readers the benefit of his terrible experience. Whether this interpretation is generous or simply the most charitable construction that can be placed on a difficult case, it has its adherents, and they read Cioran with full knowledge of his history and find in that history not a reason to dismiss him, but a reason to take him more seriously. The truth, insofar as there is a truth, probably lies somewhere in the murky territory between these positions. Cioran was neither purely evasive nor purely confessional. He was a man who had done something terrible in his youth, who knew he had done it, who was ashamed of it, and who spent the rest of his life trying to live with that shame without ever quite confronting it directly. The shame is present in the work. It is hard to imagine anyone writing so obsessively about guilt and self-disgust without having something specific to feel guilty about, but it is present indirectly, transformed into abstraction, universalized into a condition shared by all human beings rather than a crime committed by one particular person. This is what artists do, of course. They take their personal experiences and make them general, make them available to others, make them into something larger than autobiography. But when the personal experience is complicity in fascism, the transformation feels more fraught, more suspicious, more open to the accusation that art is being used to escape history. There is another way to think about this, though, one that does not resolve the contradiction, but at least acknowledges its depth. Emil Cioran was not the only person who believed terrible things in the 1930s and then, after the war, stopped believing them. He was not the only intellectual who looked at the wreckage of Europe and concluded that something had gone catastrophically wrong, that the ideologies that had promised salvation had delivered only death, that the only reasonable response to the 20th century was a kind of exhausted scepticism about all grand projects, all collective dreams, all attempts to remake the world according to an idea. This was the mood of post-war Paris, the mood that produced existentialism and absurdism and the theatre of Beckett, the mood in which Cioran found his second voice. He was not alone in his disillusionment. He was part of a generation that had seen where belief could lead and had concluded, rightly or wrongly, that unbelief was safer. The difference, of course, is that many members of that generation had been on the other side, had opposed fascism from the beginning, had suffered under it rather than supported it. Cioran was not one of them. His disillusionment was not the disillusionment of a victim, but of a perpetrator, not the wisdom of innocence, but the wisdom, if it can be called that, of guilt. Does it matter which side you are on, if you end up in the same place? Does the origin of your scepticism affect its validity? These are questions that philosophers have debated endlessly, and they do not have obvious answers. There is an argument to be made that knowledge gained through complicity is no less true than knowledge gained through resistance, that what matters is the knowledge itself and not how it was acquired. There is an equally strong argument that the source of knowledge cannot be separated from its content, that wisdom earned through suffering others is fundamentally different from wisdom earned through causing suffering, that Cioran's pessimism is tainted by its origins in a way that, say, Primo Levi's is not. Both arguments have their points. Neither settles the matter. What remains, after all the arguments have been made and all the positions have been staked out, is the work itself. The aphorisms, the essays, the books that Cioran wrote in his tiny Paris apartment during the long sleepless nights when the city was silent around him. They are still there, still available, still read. They continue to find new readers, people who know nothing of the controversy, people who encounter the trouble with being born or a short history of decay, and are struck by the precision of the prose, the darkness of the vision, the strange comfort that can be found in someone who shares your bleakest thoughts. These readers may eventually learn about the Romanian past, or they may not. If they do, they will have to make their own decision about what to do with that knowledge, whether it changes how they read the work, whether it disqualifies the author from the position of guide and companion that his books seem to offer. There is no correct answer to give them. There is only the irreducible fact that both things are true at once. This man wrote some of the most beautiful and disturbing prose of the 20th century, and this man supported a movement that murdered thousands of people. These two facts do not cancel each other out. They do not resolve into a neat formula that tells us how to weigh art against morality, how to judge a life that contained both heights and depths. They simply coexist, awkwardly, painfully, in the same biography, in the same name on the same gravestone. Perhaps that is the most Cioranian conclusion of all. He would have said, did say, many times, that life is not a problem to be solved but a condition to be endured, that the search for resolution is itself a form of delusion, that we must learn to live with contradiction because there is no alternative. He applied this philosophy to existence in general, to the question of why there is something rather than nothing, to the mystery of consciousness and suffering and death. But maybe it applies to him too, to the question of what to make of his life and his work. Maybe the only honest response to Emil Cioran is the one he himself offered to existence. Not acceptance exactly, and certainly not approval, but a kind of weary acknowledgement that this is how things are, that the world contains such cases, that human beings are capable of both great art and great evil, and that sometimes, disturbingly, these capabilities coexist in the same person. He lies now in Montparnasse, under a stone that says nothing about any of this. The trees above him shed their leaves each autumn and grow them back each spring. The tourists pass by looking for more famous names. Simone Bouet, who loved him for 50 years, who saw him through the insomnia and the poverty and the slow dissolution of his mind, lies beside him now. She outlived him by only a few years. She never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews about their life together, never tried to explain or defend him. She kept his secrets, even the ones that were no longer secret, even the ones that scholars had already discovered in the archives. She had made her choice long ago, and she stuck with it to the end. The apartment on the Rue de l'Odéon is occupied by other people now. The window where Cioran watched the Paris night still looks out over the same rooftops, though the city below has changed in ways he would probably find irritating. The notebooks in which he wrote his aphorisms are in archives, handled with gloves, photographed and catalogued and studied by academics who write dissertations about his comma placement and his use of the subjunctive. The books are still in print, still translated into new languages, still recommended by people who want their despair articulated with elegance. The debate about his past continues in conferences and journals and online forums, where people who have never read a word he wrote argue about whether he should be read at all. And somewhere, probably, a young person is reading The Trouble with Being Born for the first time, late at night, unable to sleep, feeling the strange recognition that comes when someone else has put into words a feeling you thought was yours alone. They do not know yet about the Iron Guard. They do not know about the radio addresses or the journalism or the letters praising Hitler. They know only that someone once wrote sentences that seem to understand them, that seem to speak directly to the loneliness and the doubt, and the vague sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the fact of being alive at all. Maybe they will learn the rest of the story later. Maybe it will change how they feel about what they are reading. Or maybe they will decide, as some readers do, that the words on the page are what matter, that the author's life is his own business, that the transaction between reader and writer happens in a space that biography cannot reach. Cioran himself would have smiled at the irony. He who spent his life insisting that existence was a mistake, that to be born was an affliction, that the kindest thing one could do was refrain from bringing new life into the world. He goes on existing, in a sense, in the minds of the people who read him. He who wanted only silence and obscurity has become a figure of permanent controversy, studied and debated and judged. He who said that immortality was the most revolting of all ideas has achieved a kind of immortality after all, though perhaps not the kind anyone would want. The night is deep now, and the city is quiet. In Montparnasse nothing moves among the graves. The stone above Emil Cioran gives his name and his dates, and beneath it, what remains of him is slowly becoming something else. Something that is neither Romanian nor French, neither fascist nor philosopher, neither insomniac nor finally at rest. What remains in the end is the question itself, not the answer. Cioran would have been the first to tell you that answers are for people who have not yet understood the question. But the question as a kind of permanent weather, a condition of the air around his name. Can a person be forgiven for what they believed at 23? The question sounds simple when you say it that way. Of course they can. People change. Youth is a fever. We have all believed things we would later be ashamed of, felt certainties that dissolved in the light of experience, spoken words we would give almost anything to unsay. The human capacity for growth, for transformation, for becoming someone the younger self would not recognise. This is supposed to be one of the hopeful truths about our species. We are not fixed. We can learn. We can, given enough time and enough suffering, become wiser than we were. But the question is not really about forgiveness, is it? It never was. Forgiveness implies someone doing the forgiving, a victim, a community, a moral authority with the standing to absolve. And the people Cioran wrote about in those early books, the people whose expulsion and elimination he called for with such elegant fury, are not here to forgive anyone. They are ash. They are names on memorials in countries that no longer exist. They are the absence at the centre of 20th century Europe, the silence into which all questions about guilt and redemption eventually fall. Cioran knew this. He knew it better than his critics, which is perhaps why he refused to make a public apology. An apology to whom? The dead cannot hear you. The living who might speak on their behalf have their own reasons for accepting or rejecting whatever you might say. And the act of apologising, the press conference, the carefully worded statement, the ritual of public contrition, would have struck him as obscene, a performance stage for the benefit of the apologiser, a way of closing a wound that deserved to stay open. So he said nothing. Or rather, he said everything except the one thing people wanted to hear. He wrote, for 50 years, about guilt and shame and the impossibility of innocence. He wrote about the ways we deceive ourselves, the lies we tell to make existence bearable, the moral compromises that accumulate so slowly we do not notice them until we have become someone we never intended to be. He wrote about the seduction of belief, the intoxication of belonging to a movement larger than yourself, the terrible freedom that comes when you finally see through all the ideologies and find nothing beneath them but your own exhausted reflection. Was this his apology? Was the entire body of his work, those thousands of polished sentences about despair and disillusion, a kind of extended confession, a lifetime spent circling the thing he could not bring himself to name directly? Some of his readers think so. They argue that the very bleakness of his later writing is evidence of genuine transformation, that only someone who had truly looked into the abyss of his own capacity for evil could write with such cold clarity about the human condition. The young fascist believed in redemption through violence, in the purification of the nation, in the possibility of building a new world on the ashes of the old. The old philosopher believed in nothing at all, which is to say he had learned at enormous cost that belief itself was the problem. The certainty that had once led him to praise murderers had been burned out of him, leaving only the ash of scepticism, the quiet refusal to be fooled again. Others are not convinced. They point out that Cioran never stopped being a kind of extremist, that he simply traded one form of nihilism for another. The young man who wanted to tear down bourgeois Romania and replace it with something pure and violent became the old man who wanted to tear down everything, who saw all of human history as a catalogue of errors, who could not write a sentence about hope without immediately following it with 3 sentences about the futility of hoping. This is not growth, they argue. This is merely the same temperament, the same attraction to the absolute, expressed in a different register. The fascist and the nihilist are closer than they appear. Both despise the ordinary, the moderate, the human scale. Both find in destruction a kind of aesthetic pleasure. Both would rather see the world burn than accept it as it is. And there is something to this argument, something that Cioran himself might have acknowledged in one of his more honest moments. He was not, in the end, a complicated person. His sensibility was essentially simple. He felt with unusual intensity the wrongness of things. As a young man, he located that wrongness in Romanian society, in the torpor of his countrymen, in the presence of people he had been taught to see as foreign and corrupting. As an old man, he located that wrongness in existence itself, in the mere fact of being alive, in the biochemical accident of consciousness. The target changed. The feeling did not. But to reduce him to this, to see continuity where he claimed rupture, is also to miss something important about how people actually change. We do not become different people all at once. We do not wake up one morning with new souls. We change the way a river changes its course, slowly, imperceptibly, through the gradual erosion of everything that once seemed fixed. The man who dies is made of the same water as the man who was born, but the water has travelled so far and passed through so many different landscapes that it would be strange to call it the same river. Cioran knew he was made of the same material as the young fascist. He never pretended otherwise. When interviewers asked him about his past, he did not claim to be someone else, did not try to draw a sharp line between then and now. He spoke of that younger self with a mixture of contempt and pity, the way you might speak of a relative who had embarrassed the family, someone you could not disown but did not particularly want to explain. He acknowledged the shame without ever quite performing the repentance that would have satisfied his critics. He carried the weight of it, visibly, in the stoop of his shoulders and the bitter precision of his prose, but he refused to put it down in the way that a public confession might have allowed. Perhaps this was cowardice. Perhaps he simply could not face what a real accounting would have required. Not just the admission of error, but the acknowledgement that his errors had consequences, that words published in newspapers and spoken on radio had contributed, in some small way, to a climate in which certain things became possible. To say, I was wrong, is one thing. To say I helped is something else entirely. And Cioran, for all his talk of despair and self-disgust, never quite managed to say that second thing. He kept the focus on himself, on his own suffering, on the torment of having believed. The suffering of others remained in his work strangely abstract, a philosophical problem rather than a historical fact. Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that his defenders prefer, perhaps he understood something that his critics did not, something about the limits of public confession in a world that has turned repentance into entertainment. The 20th century invented a new kind of ritual, the spectacle of the apologizing intellectual, collaborators who trimmed and turned, communists who saw the light, fascists who found democracy. The public confession was supposed to be a moment of truth, a clearing of the air, but it became instead a performance, a way of converting guilt into a different kind of capital. You admitted your sins, you expressed your regret, you were welcomed back into polite society with the understanding that the matter was now closed. Cioran refused this bargain. He refused to let the matter be closed. He refused to offer the tidy narrative of sin and redemption that would have allowed everyone, himself included, to move on. The result is that we cannot move on. His case remains open. Every few years, a scholar discovers another damning document, another newspaper article from 1937, another letter in which the young Cioran says something that makes contemporary readers wince. And every time the same debate begins again. Can we separate the work from the man? Should we? What do we owe to the dead, and what do we owe to the living, and how do we balance the claims of art against the claims of history? These questions have no answers. They have only positions, stances, choices that each reader must make for themselves. You can refuse to read him, and that refusal is not censorship but moral seriousness, a decision about how you want to spend your time and what voices you want in your head. You can read him with full knowledge of his past, letting that knowledge inflect every sentence, hearing beneath the elegant French the ghost of the Romanian he abandoned, the ideology he tried to bury. You can read him the way you read any dead author, aware that the past is a foreign country, that the people who lived there operated under constraints and pressures we can barely imagine, that judgment is easy and understanding is hard. Or you can simply read him because he wrote sentences that no one else could have written, sentences that seem to arrive from some region of experience most people never visit, and decide that whatever else he was also this, a person who knew something about despair that you wanted to know. The night has turned, finally, toward morning. In the hours before dawn, Paris is at its quietest. The cafes closed, the streets empty except for the occasional delivery truck, the metro silent in its tunnels beneath the city. This is the hour Cioran knew best, the hour he walked for decade after decade, looking at the buildings and the sky and the dark water of the Seine, thinking thoughts he would later distill into the aphorisms that made his reputation. He was not the first insomniac to find that the world looks different at 4 a.m. He was not the first person to discover that the thoughts you have when you cannot sleep are not the same as the thoughts you have in daylight. But he may have been the first to make a philosophy out of it, to argue that the knowledge available only to the sleepless was, in some important sense, the truest knowledge there was. What did he see on those long walks? What did he think about in those hours when the city belonged to him alone? We can guess a little from the books. He thought about death, of course, his own death, the deaths of everyone he knew, the great fact of mortality that gives every moment its peculiar weight and its peculiar lightness. He thought about the absurdity of effort, the way human beings pour their energy into projects that will be forgotten almost as soon as they are completed. He thought about the past, his own past especially, the country he had left behind and the person he had been there. He thought about writing, about the strange compulsion that kept him filling notebooks, even though he believed, or said he believed, that literature was as pointless as everything else. He thought about the other insomniacs of history, the sleepless saints and sinners he had read about, and he wondered what they had seen in the dark that he was also seeing. And sometimes, perhaps, he thought about nothing at all. He let his mind go blank, or as blank as an insomniac's mind ever goes, and he simply walked, one foot in front of the other, through streets he knew so well he could have navigated them blind. The body has its own wisdom after all, and sometimes the best thing the mind can do is get out of the way. The rhythm of walking, the repetition of step after step, the gradual softening of thought as the muscles take over. These were, for Cioran, the closest thing to peace he ever knew. He could not sleep, but he could walk, and walking was a kind of sleep with your eyes open, a way of being absent from yourself while still being present in the world. The Cimetière de Montparnasse opens at 8 a.m. and closes at 6 p.m. During those hours it receives a steady trickle of visitors, locals walking their dogs, tourists consulting maps and guidebooks, mourners bringing flowers to the graves of people they actually knew. The famous dead are clearly marked: Sartre and de Beauvoir, Baudelaire, Samuel Beckett, Susan Sontag. Cioran's grave is harder to find. It is in one of the older sections where the paths are narrower and the stones more weathered, and unless you know exactly where to look, you could walk right past it without noticing. The stone is simple, as he would have wanted. His name, his dates, nothing more. No epitaph, no quotation from his work, no pious sentiment about rest or peace or the hope of reunion. Just the bare facts. This person existed, and now he does not. It is the kind of grave that tells you nothing about the person beneath it, which is perhaps fitting for a man who believed that nothing important could be said in public anyway, that the essential things happened in silence and solitude, in the hours when no one was watching. Simone Boy lies beside him, as she lay beside him in life. Her grave is similarly plain. 2 lives that had been entangled for half a century, reduced to 2 stones and 2 sets of dates. Whatever they had been to each other, lovers, companions, nurse and patient in those final terrible years, is invisible here. The stone does not tell you that she stayed with him through the insomnia and the poverty and the slow crumbling of his mind. It does not tell you that she watched him forget, one piece at a time, the language in which he had made his art and his confession. It does not tell you that she never wrote about him, never tried to explain or justify him, never cashed in on the minor celebrity that attached itself to his name in the years after his death. She kept her silence, and the stone keeps it for her now. Sometimes, in late afternoon, when the light comes slanting through the chestnut trees and falls in long gold bars across the graves, Montparnasse is almost beautiful. The dead keep their own company, the living pass through on their way somewhere else. The traffic on the boulevard is muffled by the walls, and for a few moments you can almost forget that you're in the middle of one of the largest cities in the world. You can almost imagine that time has stopped, that nothing will ever change, that the dead will lie here forever in their quiet rows while the seasons turn above them, and the trees put out their leaves and drop them again, and the tourists come and go, and the city around them grows and shrinks and grows again. Cioran would have found this thought unbearable. He could not stand consolation, especially the false consolation of natural beauty. The idea that the world's indifference to human suffering was somehow comforting. He would have pointed out that the trees feel nothing, that the dead feel nothing, that the beauty is entirely a projection of the living, a story we tell ourselves to make the silence bearable. He would have been right too in his way, but the beauty exists whether he likes it or not. The light falls through the leaves, the shadows move across the stone, and somewhere a bird is singing, as birds have sung for 100 million years, as they will go on singing long after the last human voice has fallen silent. The question remains. It will always remain. There is no tribunal that can settle it, no judge who can pronounce a verdict, no statute of limitations that will finally allow us to move on. Emil Cioran was a fascist. Emil Cioran was a philosopher of despair. Emil Cioran was a stylist of extraordinary gifts, who made of French prose an instrument capable of expressing thoughts that French had never quite held before. All of these things are true. None of them cancels the others. They exist together, in the same person, in the same body of work, in the same grave, in the same cemetery, in the same city that he walked for 50 years, unable to sleep. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the refusal to resolve, the acceptance of contradiction, the willingness to hold 2 incompatible truths in the same hand. Perhaps that is the only wisdom available to us when we look at a life as strange and as troubled as his. We want our thinkers to be heroes or villains. We want our artists to be redeemed by their art or condemned by their lives. We want always the clarity of judgment, the satisfaction of knowing where we stand. But Cioran offers us none of that. He offers only the paradox of his existence, the fact that the same mind could have written those terrible early essays and those beautiful late aphorisms, that the same heart could have beaten for the iron guard and for the silent discipline of French prose. He would have liked the paradox, probably. He would have said that anyone who was not a contradiction had never really been alive. The night is very quiet now. The city sleeps, as much as a city ever sleeps. And in a cemetery in the 14th arrondissement, beneath a stone that says nothing at all about any of this, what remains of Emil Cioran continues its slow return to the earth. The atoms that were once his body are becoming part of the soil, the roots, the grass that grows between the graves. In time, they will be taken up into the trees, into the birds, into the air itself. He who could not sleep is sleeping now, if that is what you want to call it. He who could not stop thinking has finally stopped. He who spent his life writing about the burden of existence has put the burden down at last. The question remains, but the man who raised it is gone, and the night goes on without him, as nights have always done, as they will go on doing for a very long time, indifferent and dark and full of the silence that he knew so well. that he wrote about better than anyone, that he has finally, after all these years, become.